Okay, hope everyone's doing well. I do thank everyone for joining us as we're going to have a little bit of a halachic discussion that relates to this wonderful holiday that's arriving quite soon, in about 2 weeks from tomorrow night. So we are in the Pesach spirit already. But before we begin, I would like to take this opportunity of thank our sponsor. Today's shir is sponsored by Frank and Eva Mayer. It's to commemorate the yahrzeit of Frank's mother and Mayer, Gittel Bat Yosef. Yahrzeit is actually tonight. So we do thank the Mayers. Hopefully I'll have an opportunity to thank them at the end of class. May the neshama have an aliyah from our gathering here tonight to study words of Torah and to be inspired and to be prepared for this wonderful Yom Tov that's arriving very, very soon. As we're going to have a discussion about Pesach, there are things we focus on with the goal to get rid of, and then there are things that we focus on to bring in. And obviously, when we talk about getting rid of stuff, it's a reference to chametz. And I could tell you a chochmah from our grandson, our 2-year-old grandson, Yehuda Yair, that he went Sunday, I think, to the doctor just for a checkup, and the doctor looked in his ears, as doctors do. And then afterwards, he was asked, I asked him as well, what was the doctor looking for in your ear? And Yehuda Yair says, chametz. That's what he was looking for. Okay, so everyone is searching for chametz. It's something that we do. We know very well that it's a holiday that there's a focus on detaching ourselves from leavened bread. It's a detachment that obviously relates to the fact that we would not eat it, but we don't want to even own it. The Torah prohibits us from owning chametz. So how do we take care of that issue? So we're educated. We know that number one, we check and get rid of chametz. You check for chametz on the eve of the 14th. If you find things, you burn it the next day. If you don't find things, well, there's a tradition to burn things anyway, and therefore we put some effort into being sure we find something to be able to burn it. Now, the concept of bdikas chametz, although the ideal time is the eve of the 14th, which is going to be in 2 weeks from now, nevertheless, if a person is leaving their home early, they do a bdikas chametz the night before they leave. Now, it's a different type of bdikas chametz. It's a checking for chametz that, number one, does not require a bracha. The bracha was established by the rabbis specifically on the eve of the 14th of Nisan, because the language of the bracha is Asher kedishanu b'mitzvotav etzivanu al biur. Biur is destroying, getting rid of the chametz. So on the eve of the 14th, you are beginning the process of getting rid of it because the next morning you'll burn it. If you do a checking on the eve of the 12th, the 11th, the 10th, the 9th of Nisan, true, it's a mitzvah, but the bracha is not said. In addition, the custom of the 10 pieces of bread that we are so familiar with is not done if you are checking early. It is a custom that relates specifically to the eve of the 14th. Now, people wonder, what if I'm planning to be Pesach somewhere else? So do I have to check that my house before I leave a week before Pesach, for example? And the general rule is the following. If you plan to sell your property, meaning no one will be using your house. So let's say, for example, you're going Pesach to Israel, and no one here in Toronto will be using your house, and thus you sold all the chametz and the location where the chametz is, meaning you basically sold your house or leased your house on Pesach. So you really don't have a requirement to check anything because you're not going to own it during Pesach. If, on the other hand, you plan to allow other people to use your house locally, so you're not selling your house. In such a situation, you should be checking the areas that are not sold the night before you leave. Now, in a situation that you will have nowhere to check on the eve of the 14th, so for example, if a person will be flying on the eve of the 14th and will not be able to do a bdikat chametz, in such a case, even if you are selling your house, you should leave out one section from the sale and check that area the evening before you depart. Okay, so this is a law. Obviously, there's many, many details that apply. You can obviously ask if it relates to you, but it's important to remember there is a concept of a bdikat chametz that's done early, but sometimes it's not required. If I'm going to have a location, if I'm going to an hotel, and on the eve of the 14th, Thursday night, 2 weeks from now, I could do a bdikat chametz in the room that I basically leased from the hotel for Pesach. I could do my bdika there, and if no one's using my home and I'm selling it, I do not have to check at home. Okay, this is what we are told. Obviously, in the document itself, you make it clear that you're selling your property, or at least have that information that if the buyer wants access to it, that he'll know what he owns. Now, when we go ahead and get rid of our chametz, there's obviously the checking that's done. There is obviously this modern day selling that we are familiar with. I use the term modern day because the type of selling our property that we do nowadays did not exist 500 years ago. It is something that developed about 350, 400 years ago as Jews were entering into the whiskey business, and they were granted a license to sell whiskey. And they would have many, many barrels of grain whiskey that was chametz. They did not have the option of getting rid of it or of transferring it to the non-Jew, and that the non-Jew will physically remove the items from your domain. So they came up with the system of mechirat chametz that we are familiar with. This is basically a newer concept. For us Jews, a practice that's only in existence for 400 years is basically called new. But what is a requirement that is something that has roots in the Torah, and the rabbis focus in it a lot, is the idea of the nullification, the bitul chametz. In other words, when we go ahead and make the statement called chamira v'chamia deika bershuti, when I go ahead and declare that any chametz in my domain is considered like the dust of the earth, it's a statement that we're supposed to feel. That if, for example, there is some chametz in my domain, and obviously we don't want to own it during Pesach because the Torah prohibits that, I want to consider it like the dust of the earth. So keep in mind those ideas. We check and get rid of chametz, we nullify chametz, and then we also rely on the sale. That is on the getting rid of the chametz. But I think we're going to focus more on what comes into our house this year, on products that we eat. And I think I start off every single year with a statement that in this day and age, the greatest challenge to our standards for Pesach, to be sure that the food we consume is chametz free, is the issue that relates to labels. Labels. And what I mean by that is we are blessed to live in an era that we have a tremendous amount of products for Pesach. They're expensive, obviously. Many of them are perhaps not necessary, but I don't think that 70 years ago they had ketchup for Pesach. Something tells me you couldn't get that 70 years ago. I don't know. I don't remember. But we have everything you need, right? From hot sauces and pizza sauces, everything we do have. The concern exists that often labels of kosher products for year-round and kosher products for Pesach and Pesach only are quite similar. And as a result, people go to a supermarket, they purchase items on a Pesach shelf in an area where 99% of the items are kosher for Pesach, but someone might by mistake, it could be an employee in the store, or it could be someone that just returned a product to the wrong place, will place an item that's not kosher LaPesach in the Pesach section. And this creates a problem because I've mentioned over the years that every single year I get a question about a product that the people purchased. They assumed that it is kosher LaPesach, and it's not. Often the problems are not very significant. They're kitniot, but I've had as well very significant issues of products. Like there was a product that was some kind of coating for chicken, and it was used year round. The product was produced year round with breadcrumbs, and for Pesach with some kind of potato derivative, I think. And someone mixed it up and produced for Pesach chicken with what basically is chametz. And it created a major issue because it was someone in Memphis who cooked in their home, and they had a son-in-law that would come in and was always suspicious of his mother-in-law. And it happened to be that he looked at the garbage can and saw Erev Pesach, the product. And this was extremely unpleasant. And I share this story because I believe that every product that comes into your house for Pesach should be checked 3 times. Once in the supermarket when you put it in your wagon, once when you bring it into the home, and once when you use it. In other words, even if it's in your Pesach, in an area designated for Pesach, I highly recommend to check again, just to avoid issues. When there are issues, again, in most cases, they're not extremely significant, but ones that, why should we create the discomfort? And as we'll see, the laws and the customs and the history of the Pesach food are ones that have levels upon levels of practices that are stringencies. I think in our generation, this is something we should be aware of. I mention it because it's an important one. Now, before we get into a discussion that relates to matzah, I would like to briefly talk a little bit again about kitniot. And I say again, we discuss it every single year. It's a fascinating discussion. And I say it's fascinating because I'm always interested in the history of the development of halacha. It just fascinates me how things were done 800 years ago and how they were done 700 years ago and 600 years ago. And the halachic literature we study provides for us a story, and it's a fascinating story. And kitniot, for some, it's a difficult thing, and I understand very well. It would be very nice if we could enjoy our chickpeas and our legumes and our hummus and our peanut butter. There are a lot of wonderful things we would like to have, and we could be a little bit upset at our French and German ancestors for making this practice an integral part of Pesach, but I focus on the history, and that's how I approach it. Now, we've mentioned in the past the fact that Jews in French, German communities, and later on in Eastern Europe, had a custom of avoiding legumes, but not only legumes, even things that are not legumes. There were minhagim, for example, mustard, which is not a legume really. And there was a lot of curiosity among the rabbis. Why do we have such a practice? Where did it come from? And there were 2 schools that developed. One school is that legumes are similar in the way they are processed to bread. In other words, just as in the field, you would go ahead and have a pile of grain, you would have a pile of legumes. And just as you could produce flour from bread, you produce flour from legumes. And therefore, at some point, there was a sense we should prohibit it. Now, this explanation, in my humble opinion, is a weaker explanation to go ahead and place some logic into this practice that existed in the French and German communities. So I like the second approach that's presented. And it works as follows. Once upon a time, people stored grain. Once upon a time, people kept throughout the winter legumes. Quite often, they were kept together. So it was known that come Pesach, before you eat your rice, before you eat your beans, you are careful to go ahead and remove the grain, because if you're going to throw into a pot during Pesach, if you're going to go ahead and throw in your rice or throw in your beans and start cooking it, and mixed into your rice or beans are grains, you're going to have an issue here of chametz. So the tradition was, and it could be that this goes back even 1,500 years, that the Yiddish mama, the Jewish mother, would tell the child that on Pesach, we are careful with our kitniot. We are careful to check them. And perhaps as time moved on, or as we were exiled to different regions, perhaps at some point, people remember the statement on Pesach, we are careful with kitniot, not remembering that the message was that when you cook beans, be careful and be sure that there's no grains that are mixed into it, but rather understood it to mean on Pesach, we are careful, meaning we avoid it. And therefore it became a minhag. And minhagim are something that gain popularity and they are hard to change, and it became the norm. So these are reasons that are given to explain this minhag. And as a result, if you have any item that you are not sure, is it kitniot or not, you're going to go ahead and open a COR pamphlet or a CRC or an MK or an OU, and you're going to do your own research. Is that product kitniot or not? Because that's the minhag if you are in Ashkenazi. Now, the big debate over, I would say over a century already, is what happens if you have a product that there is no tradition regarding the product due to the fact that it was not in existence in Europe or in Eastern Europe. But at the same time, the logic that later rabbis gave to explain the custom does apply to it. And the perfect example would be, let's say, peanuts. Or a perfect example would be quinoa. And if you take the approach that, hey, the rabbis gave reasons, and the reasons should apply to quinoa because quinoa is similar to a grain, it's processed like a grain, perhaps you would avoid quinoa. But if you take approach number 2, which is known as Ramosha Feinstein's approach, Ramosha Feinstein's approach was, don't look at the reasons, but rather stick to the tradition. If there's a tradition to avoid a food, avoid it. We've been avoiding mustard, we avoid rice, we avoid beans, avoid it. But if there's an item that was not in existence at the time that these minhagim came and became practiced, worry not. And Ramosha believed, for example, that there's no reason to prohibit peanuts, which is interesting because nowadays I would say that the vast majority of people consider peanuts kitniot. But peanuts aside, Ramosha Feinstein clearly would have no issue at all with quinoa. And therefore, quinoa is a wonderful option for people searching for a good breakfast grain, or a lot of good dishes could be made with quinoa. And Baruch Hashem, the OU gives supervision over it. The only reason you would need supervision is to be sure that it's not produced in a field near barley. And that's an option. Now, the major discussion that we've had over the years relates to the oil that is extracted from kitniot. Because earlier on, 500 years ago, extraction of oil would take place by throwing a bean and cooking it, and then extracting it, or separating the oil from the water. And that was a problem because if you are concerned that there might be grains mixed in, if that's the minhag, by cooking it, you are creating chametz. So oils in general were avoided. Oils of kitniot were avoided until the late 19th century, early 20th century, where they finally developed equipment that can extract the oils in a dry process without the legume coming into contact with water. And the question was, would there be any issue with oil extraction, a dry oil extraction, which is done by toasting the bean or the sesame seed a little bit, and then you can get the oil out. And the great rabbinic figures of the late 19th century gave their stamp of approval, including Rabbi Yitzchak Elchanan Spector, great rabbinic figures. And I think we've talked in the past that in 1909, the chief rabbi of Yafo, Harav Avram Yitzchak HaKohen Cook, Rabbi Cook, gave supervision to a facility that produced sesame oil for Pesach with a dry extraction, and he believed that there was no problem at all. Obviously, he had to deal with some old-time Yerushalmis that were unhappy with the practice, but technically speaking, oils should be far less of an issue. Nevertheless, if for some reason Minhag Yisrael is to be strict even with oils, and therefore most of us, I think, use the very unhealthy cottonseed oil, although many of us do remember probably from 30 years ago that you had in the marketplace peanut oil for Pesach. I've mentioned in the past that I had a dream of producing or having a run somewhere for kosher Pesach peanut oil. And the reason I have such a desire is because if you look in halachic literature regarding the question of peanut oil, so Reb Tzvi Pesach Frank, a great figure in Yerushalayim some 70 years ago, wrote a letter to my grandfather, the chief rabbi of Uruguay, where he noted that your production of peanut oil is 100% fine for two reasons. Peanut most probably is not really kitniot. Oil is not an issue. So really, it would be a wonderful thing if we could go ahead and produce it. But this is a challenge. These are the minhagim that we discussed. Last year, we had a fascinating discussion that related to caraway seeds. And the reason we had a discussion was someone asked me the question, what would be the status of caraway seeds? Are they considered kitniot or not? Now, obviously, if they're pulverized, they are processed. And anything in a powder form, you have to be sure that no anti-caking agent was added, which could create a problem. But if you could go to the marketplace and purchase a bag of caraway seeds and look through it and it's clean, what would be the status? And I did a little bit of research. I started off by looking, obviously, what kosher agencies say. And even today, I opened the booklet of the MK. Someone gave me this little booklet of the MK. And it said that caraway seeds are kitniot. But with a little bit of research, I realized that's perhaps not the case. And my journey to try to figure out the status of caraway seeds took me to a statement made by Rabbi David Halevi, author of the Turei Zahav, a great rabbinic figure of the first half of the 17th century. And he says the following: if you want to know regarding Kimmel, what is the halacha? Are they considered kitniot or not? And I think we do know that Kimmel is caraway, and some old timers will tell you that they remember going to a bakery, that they would pick up a rye bread that had a few Kimmel sprinkles on top, and it was known as a Kimmel loaf, right? So Kimmel is caraway. So the Taz tells us, you want to know the status of Kimmel for Pesach? Well, I'll tell you, it depends what type of Kimmel, because there is not one but two types of Kimmel, okay? One Kimmel is called Feld Kimmel, field Kimmel, okay? And the other one is known as Krum Kimmel, crooked Kimmel, okay? And he says the following: Feld Kimmel, which is grown locally, is not kitniot. The Krum Kimmel, which is imported, That is kitniot. Okay. Now, based on that, I believe that halachic authorities say, hey, if the Taz says there's two types, and I don't know which one he's referring to, let's just consider both kitniot. So last year, I emailed some German professor who wrote a book about spices, and I asked him the question if he could identify for me the krum kimmel and the feld kimmel. He responded with great excitement, and he said the following, that krum kimmel and feld kimmel are indeed spices that were used in the past. And this is someone that didn't know the Yiddish, but did know the German. And he said that the feld kimmel is regular kimmel. And regular kimmel is what the Taz is telling me, it's not kitniot. What did the Taz refer to when he talked about the krum kimmel? That was talking about cumin. Now, if you say to yourself, wait a second, kimmel and cumin, the flavor, there's no connection at all when it comes to the flavor of the two. They're so different. So this professor wrote me that due to the fact that they were similar in shape, there were people that would make dishes that in the northern part, north of the Alps, they would use kimmel for such a dish. South of the Alps, they would use cumin, and they would call it the same dish, even though the flavor was so different. So what this professor helped me in figuring out is that the Taz believed that cumin is kitniot, but clearly even the Machmir never said that caraway are kitniot. And later on, I saw that there were those who said that all kimmel, even the cumin, is fine. So basically, a little bit of research shared with us, the fact that these caraway seeds are fine for Pesach. Obviously, we could go through a whole list of fascinating discussions and fascinating products regarding kitniot, but I think what's relevant for us is, number one, follow your practice. At the same time, don't panic. You'll end up somewhere and you're hosted by someone that perhaps has a little bit of a different minhag. You don't have to faint, especially for kitniot. And if I'm ever invited by the Sephardi chief rabbi of Israel to his home on Pesach, and whatever he feeds me, I'm going to eat. Why? I have to honor a Torah scholar more than honoring a minhag. At home, I stick to minhagim. In general, I stick to the minhagim that I saw by my parents and by my grandparents in general. But you have to go ahead and put things in perspective to know, what's important in our Yiddishkeit. Now, when it comes to products that come to the table on Pesach, obviously we have to have a discussion that relates to matzah. I teach now in chat. As you know, and I have the wonderful privilege of teaching an excellent group of kids that are interested, diverse backgrounds. What's fascinating to me is how many of them are perhaps not from what we would call an Orthodox home, but they're very traditional and they're very knowledgeable and they're very interested. Okay, and it's a good group of kids that get along well, even though you sometimes even hear discussions about our approach to Yiddishkeit. And it's a great opportunity for me to interact with the future of Klal Yisrael. Because when you talk to young kids, you see in front of you not just a 16-year-old, but you see in front of you someone 30 years from now that's going to be a 46-year-old, Be'ezras Hashem. So it's an opportunity to go ahead and share and provide some information that goes beyond the textbook and beyond the test. So I was asked, when we started this discussion regarding matzah, we're studying a unit on Pesach, and we talked about the concept of matzah shmura, that for the Seder night, you have to be sure that your matzah was produced with great caution, and as it was being watched to be sure that it doesn't become chametz, the individual doing so has to have intention, kavana. And the intention of the one watching over the harvesting, or the milling, or the kneading, or the baking, the intention should be that the product that's going to come out of this process will one day be used for the mitzvah of eating matzah the Seder night. So there should be kavanah, intention, lishma, for the sake of a mitzvah. So we had a nice discussion about it, going through the sources. And then we entered into a discussion, can there be such a thing as kavanah when a matzah is kneaded by a machine? Is that possible? Because the machine can't have kavanah, artificial intelligence can't have kavanah, but at the same time, there's someone standing by the machine, being sure nothing should go wrong. There's someone pressing the button. So is that enough? If that individual has kavanah, intention, is that good enough? We'd entered into the discussion, a very fascinating discussion. And then at some point, a student asked me, a rabbi, or some of them call me Mr. Malevsky, what's your practice? What's your practice? So usually I a little bit hesitate because I have a practice that outside of Israel is not common. Some of you remember that my minhag is that for the Seder night and throughout Pesach, we use machine. I use machine shmura, but I don't touch hand matzos. I don't touch it and I don't eat it. And outside of Israel, it's a minority opinion that people are not familiar with. But it's an opportunity to educate the students. And I decided to share with them the following. So I was going to give them a long answer as to why I use machine shmura even for the Seder night. So I shared with them the great debate that occurred in Lemberg. It's a city that today is known as Lviv. I highly recommend we don't make a trip to Lviv right now. So in Lviv, there was a major to-do in the year 1857 because the local rabbi, a great posek, Rabbi Yosef Shol Natanzon, gave his stamp of approval for a machine matzah. But down the road in Brody, there was a great rabbi by the name of Rav Shlomo Kluger who said that's unacceptable. And he had a whole list of reasons why you cannot use machine matzahs at all throughout Pesach. And it was a major debate. Now, obviously, machine matzahs became acceptable. My late father, Olav Hashem, would note that it really saved Klal Yisrael, the machine matzah. Because if we would only be using hands as the nation grows, and there would be such a mass production of hand matzah, it would be very hard to keep the standards very high. In other words, it's much easier to keep high standards with machine because it produces much more. The standards are much better with the machine because with the hand, you have to rely on people. Doesn't mean that hand is no good, but you have to be a little bit more cautious. So among communities, it became quite common that the Hasidim were less comfortable with the machine matzah. And it's logical. Hasidim are into tradition and their garb is traditional. Okay, 18th century, but it's traditional. And therefore, for them, any change was problematic. And especially it was something that was done with intention. So Hasidim are very big into their hand matzah. And among the more Lithuanian communities, there was a little bit more of an acceptance. And most probably among Hungarian, and I haven't done full research on this, I would say that among Hungarians, there was probably less of an acceptance as well. In general, that's how it works. Now, back to why do I use machine shmura? So to understand why, we have to go back to 1908. In 1908, there was a production in Yerushalayim. The fellow's name was Yosef Minsker, and he produced a very high standard machine shmura matzah for Pesach. High standards meaning the equipment was good, it didn't heat up, it was cleaned well, he had a good staff, and he produced those things that were excellent. The problem was that some Hasidim were unhappy with it, and they started putting up posters stating that we're not going to allow in Yerushalayim to change a tradition, and therefore these machine matzos are unacceptable. So this Rabbi Minsker, the producer or the owner of the bakery, turned to a rabbi whose name was Rabbi Naftali Amsterdam. Rabbi Naftali Amsterdam. Rabbi Naftali Amsterdam was a big tzaddik who was one of the greatest disciples of Rabbi Yisrael Salanter. And if you know about the yeshiva world and the yeshiva movement, when you approach the yeshiva movement from the 1890s on, especially yeshivot like Slabotka, Rabbi Yisrael Salanter was the big name. So therefore, being a disciple of Rabbi Yisrael Salanter placed Rabbi Naftali Amsterdam as a significant authority, and he lived in Jerusalem at the time. And Rabbi Naftali Amsterdam declared that you should know that after watching the process of the production of the matzos by Minster's Bakery, I am determined that these are the best matzos, kashrus-wise, than you will ever get. And he publicized it throughout the city of Yerushalayim in language that's quite fascinating, because Rabbi Naftali Amsterdam was a very humble person, never wanted to take a stand. But for him, he felt that it's important not to allow the Hasidic elements to go ahead and question Rabbi Minsker. And he wrote that these are the most kosher matzos around, and I could testify to it. And he signed Naftali Amsterdam, disciple of Rabbi Yisrael Salanter, meaning I'm a somebody. So take my opinion into consideration. In other words, he was humble when it came to his own honor, but when he felt that this is something that's not appropriate to bring these very, rigid players into a field and to make Judaism harder for people, he took a stand. And therefore, most probably, if I would visit Lithuanian non-Hasidic circles in Eretz Israel following the 1908 incident, they were probably using the Minsker matzos, which were machine shmura. Now, in 1924, the Slabotka yeshiva sent 6 students to establish a yeshiva in the city of Hebron. And these were students that without doubt interacted with followers of Rabbi Naftali Amsterdam. And Naftali Amsterdam passed away already a few years beforehand. But clearly they were familiar with the tradition that God-fearing Lithuanian Jews in Yerushalayim used the machine shmura. And the Hebron yeshiva most probably also used machine shmura as they were celebrating their Pesach there. Now, among the 6 students that arrived there in 1924 was my grandfather, Rabbi Aaron Milevsky. So therefore, my grandfather, Rabbi Aaron Milevsky, used, and I would assume starting 1924, machine shmura. And as a result, my father, Olav Shalom, used machine shmura. And that's why I use machine shmura. So I could trace back the practice to 1908. And in Eretz Yisrael, it's common. I was told that recently even the Kanievsky family used machine shmura, the Chazon Ish, from my understanding, and Rosh Shlomo Zalman Auerbach at some point, meaning in Eretz Yisrael, it's common. And if you ask how exactly could you have shmura if it has to do with intention, well, the fact is there's someone standing there by the machine to be sure everything is done right. He is guarding it with intention. So therefore, we consider it shmura. So that was my long answer to the student regarding my practice of matzah. Now, when it comes to matzah, we really have a relationship with it. And it's supposed to be that you come to the Seder night, there's this level of excitement that you want to go ahead and eat it. And as a result, there's a period of time before the Seder when we stop eating matzah. When does that period start? So I found at least 5 different minhagim. 5 different minhagim, perhaps more. And it works as follows. There are those who already 30 days before Pesach, don't eat matzah. I think we can manage, but that's as a practice by some. And the logic behind it is that you start getting into the spirit of Pesach, Shloshim Yom, Kodem Lachag, 30 days before Pesach. You are mindful of Pesach. We're obviously involved with Pesach. It's always funny that you get Shalach Manas Purim, and the next day you're trying to figure out how to get rid of it, right? Because you want to get rid of chametz. Okay, so that's an explanation why some, and I'm sure that there are some in the crowd here, that already 30 days would not eat matzah. Then there are those that Rosh Chodesh Nisan, come tomorrow night, they're not going to eat matzah. Why? Well, you're already in the spirit. It's Chodesh Nisan. Practice number 2 is there are those that from the night before, meaning the eve of the 14th. Practice number 4, actually, is the morning from dawn, Alot HaShachar Pesach. And then there's a minority opinion among the Rishonim that the prohibition only starts when you no longer eat chametz. Halachically speaking, and my practice is that I don't eat it for 24 hours before the Seder. Now, you have to remember, this is a good question that was asked today by someone. They have in the marketplace matzos that are chametz, okay? Now, I see those things as problematic in general, because once in a while you hear stories of a chametz matzah. The box is shaped exactly like kosher LaPesach matzos. They could perhaps by mistake land up on a kosher LaPesach shelf. And I'm always concerned that you're going to have a person that perhaps is a little bit older, not careful, or just simply can't read the fine print, which is something that takes place. So I personally would demand from the kosher agencies that if matzah is being produced and it's not kosher LaPesach, it has to have a warning that's at least half of the size of the box. If you ever have seen recently a box of cigarettes, they have big warnings. And I think those big warnings should be not on the corner of the box, but rather displayed with bright colors that everyone picking up such a matzah should know that it's not kosher LaPesach. That aside, those things are not considered matzah, meaning those are things that even if you have a custom, you can eat, really, because that's not a matzah that could be used for the Seder night, right? So therefore, egg matzah, obviously, you can't use it for the Seder night. So obviously that could be consumed until the time that we don't eat chametz. So chametz dika matzah is not matzah since it cannot be used for the Seder night. And the custom of avoiding relates specifically to products that we could use for the Seder night. Someone once wondered if, let's say, you have a tradition of only eating hand matzah, and someone gives you before Pesach some machine matzah. So for you, can you consider it like chametz? So I sure hope that you respect those who consider it like matzah and don't eat it. That's what we hope for. So those are a few of the interesting questions that are asked. I remember as a yeshiva boy, part of the excitement of getting involved with the laws of Pesach related to measurements. I think it's fascinating that, listen, we want to fulfill our obligation properly, and we are told that you are supposed to drink a revi'it of wine in every cup of the Seder night. You are supposed to eat a kezait of matzah for the Seder night. So you want to know what those measurements are. So over the years, we've studied that if you look at the word revi'it, right, the size of a cup to go ahead and use for the 4 cups, the revi'it itself indicates a quarter of something, a reva, a quarter. What is it a quarter of? A quarter of a measurement called a lug. It's a measurement that was used in Talmudic times. Now, what is the measurement of a lug? So the Talmud tells us that the lug has the volume of 6 eggs. Okay, so basically, if you want to drink a revi'it, it should have the volume of an egg and a half. And if you go ahead and measure the volume of an egg through displacement, you will realize that an egg is about 2 ounces. So therefore, your Kiddush cup needs to be 3 ounces, period. 3 ounces is enough. We've had over the year discussions that there was a view by some that perhaps the eggs today are smaller and therefore that should be larger. Okay, people are welcome to follow these practices, but halachically speaking, 3 ounces is enough for your wine or grape juice. Okay, now, when it comes to the measurement of matzah, so we are told that it's supposed to be the volume of an olive. And I think we do know what an olive looks like. And it's not so much, but I think you're familiar with different traditions. And therefore, different measurements are given. Throughout the years, organizations have printed these pamphlets and printed these cards that give you the knowledge of how much to eat. So if someone wants to eat a lot, they're welcome, but not always is it an actual requirement. You have to do a little bit of research, especially for those that for health reasons are limited with how much they could eat, because sometimes a lot of matzah could be unkind to the digestive system. So you have to take that into consideration as well. Whenever I have any review of the laws of Pesach, my late grandmother comes to mind. Because my late grandmother, my father's mother, took Pesach very seriously in a very traditional way, that you clean everything, that you prepare a lot of food. And already 10 weeks beforehand, you would already hear her talking about Oish, Erev Pesach. That was the bubby. That was the safta. Now, I always have a feeling that Jewish traditions are nice as long as they don't harm real Jewish traditions. In other words, Simchas Yom Tov is fundamental. And Baruch Hashem, I think we've upgraded Klal Yisrael, that we understand that not all those practices like washing every curtain or scrubbing a wall, we're not going to mock it, God forbid, but the spring cleaning is not really a requirement for Pesach. And if that could bring about an attitude that Pesach is a pain, to such an extent that the next generation really wants to distance itself from it, that could be quite damaging. So there has to be an approach of us. It's a time of happiness. It's a time of celebration. It's a time of being mindful of the gift of the Jewish journey. And if the Jewish journey is going to be viewed as a burden, how can we approach it in such a way? So therefore, it's important as we focused on the halachos. Yes, there are things that we need to be careful with, and there are things we should be mindful with. And when it comes, to koshering, there are things that we do kosher, there are things that we don't. But we should have to have that awareness and sensitivity that it should be done with a positive attitude. And sometimes it's better even to be a little bit lenient with the minhag if the big picture of Yiddishkeit stays intact. And balance is what the Jewish life is about. That's what I feel. If there are any specific questions, you're more to go ahead and either mention them in the chat, or you could go ahead and ask them. But for now, I just also want to remind everyone that the second days of Pesach are Thursday, Friday, a Friday Shabbos. And as a result of the fact that they are a Friday Shabbos, we have the 8th day is on a Shabbos. There's going to be an Eruv Tafshilin on Thursday, the 21st, the Eruv Tafshilin. The Eruv Tafshilin, we've studied in the past, gives us the ability to prepare from Friday Yom Tov to Shabbos. Usually you don't prepare any Yom Tov for the next day. So to remind us that this is specifically for Shabbos, we go ahead and we have the Eruv Tafshilin. So that's one piece of information. I hope it will be in the bulletin as a reminder. We'll get to that as well. Also, another reminder is that if you are a firstborn, there is a tanis bechoros, the tradition of fasting. However, if you participate in the siyum, you are released from it. And I plan to broadcast it on Zoom this year as well. We're going to have a Zoom from upstairs on Erev Pesach for someone that does not have the ability to come. That too is considered participation. And therefore, by tuning in, you could consider yourself as a participant of a siyum, and thus, as a result, you could go ahead and eat. Okay. And in general, if there are any specific questions that you do have, you could always contact me through email. Please remember to return your shtar. I'm going to have to be in touch with some people to just verify time zones, because for those in Israel, obviously they're going to be doing an earlier sale. So let's keep that in mind. Now, what happens if one has a juicer that is only used for juice during the year? Does it need to be kosher? So if you have any equipment that throughout the year you use, there is an understanding that you won't have the complete sensitivity. It should have some level of koshering. Even something, that it was only used for carrots. Perhaps, a person put it in the sink. So minhag, especially among Ashkenazim, it should be kosher. It should be kosher. So again, this was a juicer used only for juice during the year.
Can you kosher it if it's made out of plastic?
So hard plastic is kosherable. Ramosha was not a fan of it, but the OU does. And therefore, if it's a hard plastic that's not going to be damaged by the boiling water, that is doable. And you can pour the boiling water on it because it's not a clear issue. You clean it well, pour the boiling water on it, and you would be fine. Okay, that takes care of that. Very good. Rabosai, next week we meet Emertz Hashem for a pre-Shabbos Hagadol drasha. It'll be a little bit of thought and feelings as we approach Pesach. That's an opportunity for everyone also perhaps to review the Haggadah, get into the spirit. There are some wonderful things we could discuss. For now, I wish everyone a meaningful Pesach preparation season. It should be indeed Zman Simchasenu. We should hear good news for Klal Yisrael and Eretz Yisrael. Now they're going through some a painful brutality, which we need assistance from above, and hopefully we could all do our part in prayer, and hopefully we should merit a Yeshua from these subhuman, these chayas that are making our brothers and sisters in Eretz Yisrael going through difficulty. I would also like to take this opportunity to thank our sponsors again. And this shir tonight was sponsored by Frank and Eva Meyer. It's to commemorate the yahrzeit of Frank's mother, Anna Meyer. Gittel Bat Yosef. The yahrzeit was actually tonight and tomorrow. Neshama Shav and Aliyah from our words of Torah, from our gathering here for the sake of Torah mitzvos, and everyone should have a wonderful, wonderful evening and a wonderful Shabbos. Bye-bye.